Welcome to The Pointy End. I'm Keith Sutherland. Today my guest is Senator Bridget McKenzie, Nationals Senator Victoria. Welcome, Bridget.
Great to be back, Keith.
Now, you've been in very prominent since the start of this term of Parliament with lots of different things. We won't talk about filibustering, we won't talk about Q&A, but we'll go straight to the one where been a lot of prominence this last couple of weeks, the gun-toting senator from Victoria. Do you think that it was probably handled okay? Because we've had two sides of politics there with Malcolm Turnbull, Tony Abbott sort of coming from different directions. But at the end of the day, I know it's a state government matter and they couldn't resolve that. So it's still sort of left in limbo. Were you happy with the outcome, or would you rather see some resolution when the states all met with your Justice Minister, Keenan? But nothing seems to be resolved and it's still there. And Senator Lionhelm from your part of the Senate was talking about it and saying there's deals done. Was it?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. Senator Lionhelm produced the emails and he was of the very clear understanding that a deal had been done for his vote on a piece of migration legislation around the sunset, putting a sunset clause on the importation of the Adler lever-action shotgun. As we saw, yes, there was a significant debate and the states were unable to come to a resolution about how they wanted to categorise the 7-shot lever-action shotgun. As right now, the 5-shot lever-action is in Category A, the most easily accessible category of firearm in this country. And it's there for a good reason. To then say you want to put 2 more shots in and suddenly that becomes a D category firearm just is incongruous. It doesn't make sense. It's an illogical decision based on emotions and fear and a lack of knowledge rather than any evidence-based. And as you know, Keith, you appreciate science-based, evidence-based approach to policy development.
Climate change maybe, but not guns.
Well, to all, I don't think it should be limited to one topic or another. If
Correct.
We're going to be wanting to be purposeful, deliberate and effective, we need to ensure that evidence informs our decision-making as policymakers. And putting that gun in D is not based on science or fact. So for the states to actually have that debate as is right and proper and not come to agreement, I think is a good thing, because otherwise it would have been put into a category that it actually should not be in. We're very lucky in this country that we have such a rigorous National Firearms Agreement. It's lasted us for 20 years since the tragedy of Port Arthur, and I think it does get the balance right between community confidence around the appropriate use of firearms and those that like to hunt and shoot and attend Olympics and win gold medals and look after their animals on their farms and look after the environment by dealing with feral pests also have access to the firearms in an appropriate manner. What we're not hearing enough about from either the government or those in the anti-gun lobby is the problem of illicit firearms on the streets of Melbourne, on the streets of Sydney, in the hands of criminal gangs, causing havoc, and our inability to deal with the flood of those guns across our borders. That's where the public conversation needs to be, instead of attacking law-abiding firearm owners. And
there seems to be a bit difference of opinion with your national colleagues and the Liberal Party on the issue. I noticed last night that the Essential poll said 44% said it's not strong enough, the gun laws, and 45% said it's about right. So you sort of, we're in the middle there. But I agree with you.
And then ask who's actually read
guns.
it or has any understanding, and you get a very different, much lower percentage, I would suggest.
So you're saying the Essential poll's probably not right in those sort of
What
areas.
I'm saying is that we're asking an emotive question to a community that doesn't have... What the debate highlighted was the lack of knowledge across the media. It was being called a rifle instead of a shotgun. They're incredibly different things. There was a whole range of inaccuracies in the media coverage, not deliberate, but simply because this is a topic that most Australians, most media outlets aren't actually across. And yet when it's so fundamental in so many ways to people's livelihoods and lives, we need to be, I think, trying to have an honest and open debate, and that requires the right information.
Good to see the passion on it, because I know you're a shooter and you're supporting the other side that we have been brainwashed, I guess, from another side of politics and media, I guess. So it's good to hear that other viewpoint. So well done. Moving on, now you've been in power for the last few months, 3 months or so. How do you think it's really going? Because you've got a 1-seat majority we'll come to what's going on in the Senate. There's been a lot of changes in 24 hours, but with that one-seat majority, there seems to be lots of compromise. And I know politics is the art of compromise, but there seems to be a hell of a lot more, and we've seen we talked about the Senator Leyonhjelm's vote to have refugee policies, and we'll come to that one as well. But there seems to be the policies that are out there, and Malcolm Turnbull's been putting a lot of policies out there, waiting for public opinion and backtracking on lots of things. He did it a lot with his 12 months previous, up to the election in July, but it just seems to be a little bit wishy-washy. Not a lot of legislation is coming through. We're talking a lot, but not much is happening.
All right.
And you'll say that government's going really well.
I completely disagree, Keith, but
Good.
Thanks for, mapping out where you want me to go. But I think what was fantastic a couple of weeks ago was to be a Victorian senator that chaired the inquiry into the legislation that would actually back our CFA here in our state. That was one of the first pieces of legislation that we committed to delivering as government, and we did it. We absolutely did it.
Still got to go to the High Court, of course.
Well, that will be a matter... No, that's all been...
The legislation has gone through.
The legislation has gone through. And so
but then they reckon it's going to be challenged.
EBAs that undermine a volunteer organisation's capacity to do its job won't actually be allowed through the Fair Work Commission. So I think it's a fantastic piece of legislation. Victorians obviously did because they backed the coalition government at the federal election.
No doubt.
So, that's a fantastic thing that we've been able to achieve in coming to office. A couple of weeks ago, again, $6.3 billion worth of savings through. That's 20% of what we're able to achieve in the whole entire last parliament. Absolutely, in 20% in 1 week. 11 billion in total since we've come into office.
Compromise with a lot of things.
We've been able to achieve, because the reality that no one actually wants to talk about is that every single month we're paying $1.3 billion in interest. Every single month. That's a lot of schools, it's a lot of hospitals, it's a lot of law enforcement, it's a lot of concessional loans, it's a lot of welfare commitments and childcare funding, etc. So if we want to get real about running and being in the type of country that we all want to be a part of, then you have to get serious about actually paying down the debt so we've got the dollar to do it. And we've been able to achieve that, absolutely. But when you talk about
pays
compromise,
off a little bit though.
It's about politics. Will we rather sit on the high moral ground and not achieve anything for 3 years? No, we're here to deliver an economic agenda that will grow our economy, jobs in towns like Bendigo and the regions. That requires actually making sure we get legislation through, and our ministers have been really, really successful at achieving that thus far.
And that's good that you're sort of talking about, because we talked ad nauseum through the election campaign, jobs and growth, jobs and growth. But in actual fact, we haven't sort of seen that evidence of the jobs coming through at the moment. And this doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen overnight.
The reason why we say it is it's something we actually want to achieve. So when we talk about the free trade agreements, yes, we've signed them. We did Singapore again last week. And that actually means growing jobs in towns like this with small to medium enterprises actually being able to access new markets that aren't available domestically for their products and services. And that's a great thing because it means they'll be able to employ more people. And
good for the farming areas, of course, because Bendigo is one of those areas
that's we just don't grow things, we make things too, which I think is one of the great things about Bendigo and its manufacturing heart.
We'll move on to another topic which has been in the news this last few days, basically around the immigration changes. And it's a fairly harsh policy, and I'm not sure if it's wedge politics, but even if it is, it's going to be really interesting to see where the Labor Party sit on this one, whereby those refugees that have come, or in Nauru and Manus Island, of course, then they will never come to this country. But how the hell does that happen in subsequent governments in the future? How do you really... It's all very well to say that in this 3-year term, but beyond this 3-year term, how do you really police that? And it's just rhetoric at this stage. I know it's tough, and you have stopped the boats, no question about that. But how do you really police that? But the other part of it that really disturbs me is people that have already been refugees, they're living in this country. How do we send them back, really? How do you do that?
Keith, what the announcement to change the Migration Act does is send an incredibly strong message to the 14,000 people in Indonesia who are seeking to come to this country illegally. It sends an incredibly powerful message to the people that want to trade in that misery, the people smugglers, that under no circumstances, if you come to our country illegally, will you be able to settle here or be here? And you can't get any more emphatic than that. What we do know that as a nation, you know, our refugee intake is the third highest in the world. From UN. So if you want to come to Australia, get into your local UNHCR camp. Follow the proper processes, and we are an incredibly welcoming and open nation for you to visit. In terms of our refugee intake, we've gone from 13,750, increasing it to 18,750, and that's in addition to the 12,000 Syrian and Iraq refugees. So I think on one level, the government is committed to pulling its weight internationally in terms of refugee intake, whilst maintaining our very strong border protection policies. What we've been able to do is ensure it's our government that's made sure there's no children in detention. It's our government that's shut 17 detention centres and sending a very clear message that if you want to come to Australia, we will welcome you with open arms. There are passages and ways and means to get here that are internationally agreed, and we absolutely support those methods for coming and becoming an Australian citizen.
I'm not blaming your government for Manus Island. Of course, that was a Kevin Rudd thing. Nauru, okay, it went back to John Howard and it was working at the time. It's certainly them, when they changed the legislation, everything went crazy, of course. But you didn't really answer the existing people in this country. What happens to them? Because I watched Q&A on Monday night. Susan Lee was a bit stumped and Tony Jones had a gotcha moment because he'd found out in the afternoon that those existing people are supposed to come back to, or go back to destination of origin, i.e. you can't go back to Syria, you can't go back to Iraq. What happens to those people that are living in this country that get caught up in this legislation?
Well, what we do know that in terms of Nauru, in PNG, etc., we are working on a regional settlement solution. And so I envisage that those people will be part of, if they can't go or won't go back to their origin country, that they will be part of a regional settlement solution.
On that point, Tony Abbott said he made a mistake by not adopting the Malaysian solution. I've watched Julie Bishop the last week say that we are trying to get people. Cambodia didn't work, a lot of money, $55 million or thereabouts to send 4 people, and I don't think there's anyone other than one person living there now. But that's been talked about for a long time, but nothing seems to be forthcoming in that area.
Yeah, I think, Keith, what we've seen with what's going on in Europe of recent times, that the whole international conversation is having to change around refugees, people movement more generally. And so I think what you'll find in conversations going forward is that there's I think a much pertinent recognition of the global challenge, and that regions must work together as Europe's finding for itself, and we as a region hopefully will be able to come up with an appropriate solution for us here.
Yeah, there's no easy answer because we're part of a coalition that has helped the situation with refugees moving, and you wouldn't blame them, of course. If I was living in one of those countries and my town was being bombed, I would have moved with my family. Anyway, another one that's been a topical issue was Treasurer Scott Morrison last week brought out an affordability policy on housing. And we've seen the real estate market going berserk in all parts of the country.
Some areas more so than others.
Yeah, and I accept that. Sydney,
and
Melbourne.
some stock more than others.
Sydney, Melbourne, and I noticed some regional figures come out in the last week from CoreLogic to say there hasn't been a huge increase in regional Australia. There's certainly the Melbourne, Sydney market has gone berserk. It seems like we're going to have an oversupply in Brisbane with multi-lot units, the same in Melbourne, of course, mainly the Docklands area, which will have an effect on the market. But there's no point, in my opinion, talking about, and this is something I'm pretty passionate about, there's no point talking about housing affordability if we don't, the elephant in the room is negative gearing. I'll forget capital gains because that gets a bit complicated, but the negative gearing is an issue that it seemed to me that Joe Hockey talked about it, it seemed to me Scott Morrison talked about it, if you believe the media, and also Malcolm Turnbull. But then it came to pre-election, and of course that was going to be the distinguishing factor between Labor and the coalition. But if you don't talk about negative gearing, how can you change affordability?
Oh, look, Keith, and you're in the business, so you understand more than most the complexities around the housing market. I think you're right, you've mentioned the complexities around different stocks, apartments versus house and land. For me, the simple answer to housing affordability is the same issue with skills and experience out in the regions and depopulation issues. For me, the solution to housing affordability is everyone comes and lives in beautiful Bendigo, Ballarat, Shepparton, etc., Chuka, where you do have a fabulous property to raise your family, a sense of community and some great global job opportunities going forward, particularly in agribusiness and tourism. But that, again, is a simplistic response. It isn't just about supply, but what we know about the housing market is it's not just the federal government's levers to pull, right?
Understand.
We've got, local governments that hold up planning permits, I'm not kidding, for 12 years for some
I can attest to that in a land subdivision.
So you've got local government dragging the chain. You've got state governments whose only form of revenue raising now is things like land tax and stamp duty, etc., after the GST. So they've got a role in some of the levers that they have around regional development programs as well, in terms of what supply is being released, etc., and what sort of incentives are given to people to move and shift where. And then you've got obviously the federal government can play generally in tax policy. So I think what we have committed to, and what Morrison most recently has said, is he's sitting down with his counterparts across the states early December at their financial ministers meeting to actually start talking about this. Okay, as a collective, governments of all persuasions across this country, what are we going to do to address housing affordability?
But we're not talking about negative gearing. Why aren't we talking about that one?
Who knows what's going to come up, Keith?
Well, I think that you can't sort of isolate that.
Well, all right. So we're going to accept, Bill Shorten's negative gearing thought bubble. There is no research behind that. When it's asked, has there been any modelling on that particular policy? Zero zip. The modelling that has been done actually shows there'd be quite a catastrophic effect on housing prices, which for most Australians, particularly those of a generation who don't have a lot of super, their whole wealth is actually locked up in their home. So if you take one out of three buyers out of the market, if you take those that are ensuring supply for our rental market out of the market, then you're going to have rents going up, you're going to have people's housing equity decrease, which is a significant economic impact.
That's really a scare tactic that was used during the election campaign.
No, it's based on research.
But let's come back to first home buyers. It's down to the lowest level it's been since 1971. 13.4% of people in the market they're priced out of the marketplace. So negative gearing has got a very big effect. And
say they're priced out of the market, Keith. I mean, I don't know if you read Bernard Salt's, smashed avocado.
Yep, I loved it.
And I loved it too. And I thought of my own children and thought,
and my
children, going to own your house
Dennis's children. We've talked about this.
Dinner every second day. So I think there's, as I said earlier, this is a complex issue. I think it's a great Australian dream to own your own home, and all of us want our children to have that opportunity to grow their wealth and have that sense of security that most Australians have been able to achieve by owning their own home. But it isn't as simple as saying the negative gearing policy is what has to change. It's going to require changes across regulatory environments for local, state, federal and cultural changes, such as the millennials, God love them,
I was going to talk about
their
feta,
to actually think, all right, if I want to own my own home, I need to heads down, bum up, save.
As we all did. That's right. It was the only way to get a house.
Tough. It's very boring.
Yeah, I know.
It's not fun at all.
Yes, I've got a daughter in the marketplace as well. Finally, now what's on your agenda for the next 2 3/4 years? What do you really hope to achieve? I know you're doing great things, and as I said, you've been very prominent on lots of different issues, but what would be your purpose in the next 3 years, other than serving us Victorians, of course, in a very good way? But is there an issue that you'd love to see come to the fore in the next period of your government because now you've got another 6 years to go from here.
I do, Keith. So, and I've been thinking about that a lot. So for me, making sure regional Australia is a core part of the government's innovation agenda, ensuring things like digital ag and tech startups are actually driving our productivity gains in agriculture and in industries for regional areas, ensuring that we're a lot more connected. So I'll be pushing for more money to be spent on more mobile phone towers and ensuring that we have fast, reliable internet right across the country, not just in capital cities. That's a real key driver for me. So, you know, in 6 years I'll come back and you can tell me, did I get it right or not? But I'm really going to be pushing that. And obviously for me, education's a key issue in ensuring that more and more young people from the regions have access to high quality education.
Just before we get off that point, and I accept what you're saying, it was interesting. I had somebody sitting in the same chair this morning. We talked about the Loddon-Campaspe Regional Assembly that had in Bendigo a couple of weeks ago with Daniel Andrews and 8 government ministers. One of the funny little quirks that came out of it was, why wouldn't you put Telstra repeaters on top of those silos when we go into country area where the thing was, the coverage is not very good. So, and the other point I heard this morning was the Gold Coast Council are spending $3 million to try and get fast broadband for obviously the Commonwealth Games coming up. So it was just a couple of little issues that have come up in the last 24 hours. So I know you are passionate about it. I am very passionate about the NBM and different opinions, of course, on it. But it's something that
but
it's
you've
all
got
part
to be
and
happy
parcel.
that we've prioritised regional areas over city areas.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's the big shift for me. And you know, there was no mobile phone tower program under the previous Labor government. They didn't care what happened once you got outside, you know, Melbourne or Sydney. And I think that's been a great shift. But I think we have to do a lot more if we're going to capture all the opportunities that the 21st century presents our community.
Well, Bridget, thank you so much for appearing on The Point again today.
Anytime.
Always love having debate with you on different topics. And it's so good, I've got to say, that to have a regional senator that talks about regional issues, because far too often in the past we've had senators for Victoria and every other state, but they forget about regional areas. And I think it's so important that you are representing all of us in Victoria, and at least in Bendigo and other areas, we've got a say and we've got a voice in Parliament. So thank you for appearing on the program. Really appreciate it.
And